All right, so President Biden hopeful of a ceasefire, temporary one at that, by Ramadan, which begins on the 10th of March. Let me go across to CNN's White House correspondent Arlette Saenz, who's now joining us. So the president, while on a pit stop in New York, answering reporters' questions, saying that he's hopeful that by early March there will be a ceasefire. What gives him hope? What is the status of talks right now between Israel, mediated, of course, by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt?
Well, the White House has yet to explain why specifically the President Biden mentioned Monday as his hope for when an agreement could be reached on a temporary ceasefire that would allow for the release of hostages. But officials do feel that progress has been made in the negotiations. Over the weekend, negotiators met in Paris, and then there were talks yesterday in Qatar. And CNN has previously reported that in these negotiations, Hamas has backed off of some of their demands, like pulling out all Israeli troops from Gaza in order to release hostages. The belief right now from officials familiar with the talks is that the initial round of hostages could come to about 40 hostages that could be released if a temporary ceasefire and a deal is met. That would include some Israeli female soldiers as well. But this morning, even as the president is expressing optimism about a deal coming together soon, the Israelis aside, officials said that they were surprised by President Biden's comments, that they don't feel like there has been a specific time frame for when this agreement could be reached. Now, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan over the weekend had said that he had hoped that there might be a closer framework, a closer final agreement in the coming days. It just still remains entirely unclear whether that progress will be made. Now, as you noted, there's been some hope from officials and a desire that they strike some type of deal before Ramadan, which is set to begin on March 10th. There is also significant concern about Israel's expected operation in Rafah. The U.S. has been pressing Israelis officials to really develop a plan to get civilians out of harm's way before they launch any type of campaign there. But it's very clear that the U.S. is still hopeful that some type of agreement can be reached in the coming days. It's not clear if that will be by that Monday timeframe that the president expressed, but there is hope that these negotiations will continue to move along and that hostages will soon be able to get out with that temporary ceasefire, and the hope that then they would be able to work towards additional conditions to get even more hostages out and extend a ceasefire even longer.
But there is still a degree of lack of trust, if you will, between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. President Biden has previously characterized some of Israel's response as over the top, and you referenced America's criticism of the planned operation into Rafah. How are they planning to bridge that divide?
Well, we have seen this frustration emerging between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Oftentimes, that frustration has been behind closed doors. Their conversations have been quite animated as the president has urged Israel to take a different approach with their campaign. And we have seen some of that bubble over into public view. I think at this time, what the president's trying to do is speak to Netanyahu and encourage him to come to an agreement when it comes to getting those hostages out, an agreement when it comes to getting some type of temporary ceasefire. And last night, in an interview with a late night host here in the U.S., Seth Meyers, the president said that Israel will begin to lose more international support if they continue their campaign the way it's been conducted. So you hear him publicly really trying to pressure Netanyahu to take more care with their campaign, protect civilians, and try to secure the release of the hostages. But at this time, even as officials say they've seen progress when it comes to the negotiations, seen Hamas change some of their demands, it's entirely unclear whether all the parties will be able to come together to reach this kind of agreement. There's also those concerns about a two-state solution. That is something that the U.S. has been pushing Israel on from the beginning. Netanyahu really so far has shown resistance to the idea of creating a separate Palestinian state. And so that's one of the challenges the president's also facing when it comes to this war in Israel, or between Israel and Hamas, and trying to bring it to an end, as many parties involved would like there to be a two-state solution at the end of this.
And finally, Arlette, there's also the problem of the domestic challenge and the domestic repercussions that President Biden's facing as a consequence of this continuing war. Talk to us about how this may impact his own chances, particularly in the primaries. I believe Michigan is the next proximate primary, and there a lot of Democrat voters are upset with President Biden not doing enough to stop this war.
Yeah, there has been a lot of frustration and discontent growing within President Biden's Democratic Party. That specifically comes from Arab American, Muslim American, and young voters who are incredibly frustrated with the president's response to the war taking place between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And as you noted, the Michigan primary will be a key test for President Biden. That is taking place today, and there is a campaign underway there to encourage voters in the Democratic primary to vote uncommitted today when they head to the ballot box. There's a group called Listen to Michigan that has been calling over 100,000 people in Michigan, encouraging them to vote uncommitted. They hope to have about 10,000 people there voting uncommitted today, really trying to show the president the power of the voters who are frustrated with his response to the war in Gaza. You know, Michigan is a state that Biden narrowly won against President Trump in 2020, and Muslim American voters make up over 140,000 voters in the state. So it's really critical, these groups believe, for the president to get on board with a ceasefire, just showing the power that they could have in this Michigan primary. And then there's questions about how it would affect specifically the youth vote more broadly in the country. You know, Michigan does have significant Muslim American, Arab American populations, but then there is the concerns from youth voters as well, who are spread out across the country. So there's real questions about how the president's handling of the crisis in Israel and in Gaza will impact his chances, especially when he looks towards the general election, and every vote will count as he's trying to defend these battleground states, specifically a state like Michigan, which was pivotal to his win back in 2020.
That's a wrap, and we'll keep an eye out on not just that development about this impending or the ceasefire that everyone is hoping will likely come through soon, possibly before the start of Ramadan, which is, of course, in the first week of March, and whether or not the Netanyahu administration will come around to the American view and the view of the mediators, that's Qatar and Egypt, to have some kind of a temporary pause in exchange for the release of at least 40 hostages, as Arlette Saenz was reporting for us from Washington.